and I'm the acting director of the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds program. It's day 3 for me, so I am learning along with you. And what I have learned as I transition into this role from my previous role within the office is that your projects and implementation of the SLFRF are doing a lot of good in your communities. The housing, workforce programs, clean water infrastructure that you're delivering with these funds are really going to make a deep impact in your communities. So I want to thank you for being such good stewards of the SLFRF funding, for delivering on the projects. I look forward to having you learn about the items in the interim final rule. And so thank you for the partnership. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Jen North, who will walk us through how we got here and what you can expect from this presentation. Once again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Vero. And good morning, everyone. My name is Jen North, and I am the policy lead for the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds program. And I'm pleased to be here with you to talk about the exciting new eligible uses for the SLFRF program. To get the most out of this orientation to the new interim final rule, we recommend that you have the overview of the interim final rule printed or open in your browser, so you can go back to refer to it as you follow along online or over the phone. Following along in the overview of the 2023 interim final rule will help you as you use the full interim final rule to fully understand all of the new eligible uses. Please keep in mind, though, that the overview is a simplified user guide to the interim final rule provisions and does not describe all terms and conditions associated with the use of SLFRF funds, and does not describe all requirements that may apply to this funding. Recipients should refer to the 2023 interim final rule for a complete description of the new eligible uses and associated requirements. Before we dive into the details, I want to echo Vero's remarks that the projects you are implementing with your SLFRF funds are truly remarkable. And the work that you are undertaking with these funds will have a deep impact on your communities for years to come. And so we thank you for the immense amount of work that you're doing, and we look forward to continuing our partnership together. And so to that end, we are pleased to be speaking with you today about the interim final rule that we released last week. As you may know, in December of 2022, Congress amended the SLFRF program, adding 3 new eligible uses to provide recipients with additional flexibility to provide emergency relief from natural disasters, to build transportation infrastructure, and to support community development. Since this legislation passed, our team has been working hard to develop the framework for how recipients may use SLFRF funds towards these new eligible uses. And last week, we released an interim final rule that does just that. And momentarily, our team will be providing an overview of these new eligible use categories. I want to note that generally, the amendments to the SLFRF program did not alter the existing eligible uses provided in the American Rescue Plan. You may continue to use your SLFRF funds according to the final rule as you have been planning to do so. And if you're looking for information about the original eligible use categories, you will still consult the 2022 final rule, the overview of the 2022 final rule, and associated materials. If you are considering using funds for the new eligible uses provided in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023, passed in December of last year, we think this webinar will be helpful to you. So today we're going to summarize each of the 3 new eligible uses, discuss the public comment period and how you can provide comments on this interim final rule, and then close with a brief question and answer session. Again, thank you very much for the remarkable work you're doing in your communities. And I will now turn it over to Carrie-Ann Corrales to discuss the first new eligible use.
Good morning, everyone. As Jen said, my name is Carrie Ann Corrales. I'm part of the SLFRF policy team here within the Office of Recovery Programs. I work here in the Logan Square neighborhood of the city of Chicago, and I'm really excited to walk y'all through the first of the 3 new eligible uses provided in the IFR that was released last week. Before we begin, as Jen mentioned, I want to emphasize that this is going to be a summary of providing emergency relief from natural disasters. I'm going to highlight the key points of the new use and talk through how to think about the interim final rule when you are in your decision-making processes. Let's look at what you're going to learn in this section. So first, we're going to have an orientation to the newly available activities under the emergency relief from natural disasters eligible use category. And then we'll review the 2-step process outlined in the IFR for identifying an eligible project. As a reminder, generally, the existing uses described in the 2022 final rule remain available and unchanged, so you can continue to use your funds in accordance with the final rule as you have been planning to do so. If you're following along in the overview document, we are on page 4. So recipients can use their SLFRF funds to provide emergency relief from natural disasters or the negative economic impacts of natural disasters. Recipients seeking to use SLFRF funds for this new eligible use category should undertake the following 2-step process. The first step is to identify a natural disaster that has occurred or is expected to occur imminently, or a disaster that is threatened to occur in the future. And once you've identified a natural disaster, then you will need to identify emergency relief that responds to the physical or negative economic impacts or the potential physical or negative economic impacts of the identified disaster. And we'll say this a couple of times, the emergency relief must be related and reasonably proportional to the impact identified. So we're going to go through each of those steps. So first, we're going to go through how to define a natural disaster as outlined in the IFR. Treasury provided the definition of a natural disaster in the IFR that you can see here. An eligible natural disaster can be any one of the events listed as long as it is attributable to natural cause, but the natural disaster can also be another type of natural catastrophe attributable to natural causes that causes or may cause substantial damage, injury, or imminent threat to civilian property or persons. Once you've identified an eligible disaster, recipients should next identify emergency relief from the natural disaster. The definition in the IFR for emergency relief is assistance that is needed to save lives and to protect property and public health and safety, or to lessen or avert the threat of catastrophe, which you can see below. The assistance must be related and reasonably proportional to the physical or negative economic impacts of the natural disaster that has occurred or is expected to occur imminently, or to the potential impacts of a natural disaster that is threatened to occur in the future. We're going to go into the differences of these 2 approaches in just a minute. As I mentioned, when you are identifying emergency relief, recipients can address the impacts of a natural disaster that has occurred or is expected to occur imminently, or to the potential impacts of a natural disaster that is threatened to occur in the future. What this means is that recipients can address the impacts of a natural disaster that has already happened or is about to happen. For example, if you have a hurricane that's about to strike in the coming days and a recipient is providing emergency relief to save lives and protect property and public health and safety from that particular event. Or if a recipient wants to provide emergency relief to lessen or avert the threat of catastrophe, meaning a recipient identifies a natural disaster that is likely to occur at some point in the future. In the IFR, you're going to see that Treasury identified a non-exhaustive list of eligible emergency relief, which means that the listed eligible uses include some, but not all, of the uses that could be eligible. You'll see that the list distinguishes between emergency relief provided from a declared or designated natural disaster that has occurred or is expected to occur imminently. You can see that in letter A here on the slide, and the emergency relief provided from the threat of a future natural disaster, which is B here on the slide. So first, we're going to talk about responding to a natural disaster that has occurred or is expected to occur imminently. Recipients should first identify a natural disaster that meets Treasury's definition of natural disaster, and then identify excuse me, an emergency declaration or designation for the recipient's geography and jurisdiction in the form of one of the items listed here. So first, you might identify a relevant Stafford Act declaration. It might be an emergency declaration by the governor of a state or a tribal government, or we provided the ability for recipients to designate the event of a natural disaster by the chief executive of a recipient government, as long as there's documentation that the event satisfies the definition of natural disaster. Again, you only need one type of declaration or designation. And we also want to mention that not all disasters that have an emergency declaration necessarily meet the definition of natural disaster. You can see here and in the overview the non-exhausted lists of enumerated eligible uses for declared or designated disasters. Please again refer to the IFR and the overview for additional details on all of these enumerated uses. And as we mentioned, recipients can also design their own emergency relief by using that two-step process for designing an eligible use outlined in the IFR. So next, we're going to walk through the second pathway. So as I mentioned, you can also have the opportunity to use your state and local funds to address the threat of a future disaster through mitigation activities. You're going to follow the same two-step process for identifying the disaster and emergency response. However, there's a few differences here between mitigation activities, depending on the size and scope of the project. And so we're going to go through those in more detail. If you're providing assistance to lessen or avert the threat of a future natural disaster and its potential physical or negative economic impacts, a recipient should document evidence of historical patterns or predictions of natural disasters that would reasonably demonstrate the likelihood or future occurrence of a natural disaster in its community. So in the IFR, we give the example that a recipient could use FEMA's National Risk Index to establish the likelihood of future hurricane, or a tribal government could cite indigenous traditional ecological knowledge to determine future risks. Recipients should also use this evidence to support a determination that the mitigation activities would be related and reasonably proportional to the threat of a natural disaster. Under the natural disasters eligible use category, enumerated eligible uses include mitigation activities, which again, you can find more information about in the IFR in the overview. We also outlined in the overview that mitigation activities can be standalone projects that reduce or eliminate the potential impacts of the threat of a natural disaster, but they may also be incorporated into repair or reconstruction projects that address impacts from a natural disaster. So for example, if a recipient is repairing an asset due to damage from a natural disaster that has already occurred, recipients can also incorporate mitigation activities into the project to lessen or avert the threat of a future catastrophe. For mitigation activities with total expected capital expenditures of 1 million or greater, recipients, except for tribal governments, must complete and meet the substantive requirements of a written justification for the capital expenditures in the project. The written justification process is similar to the written justification requirements set forth in the 2022 final rule, with differences related to addressing specific emergency relief from natural disasters. Your written justification will include a description of emergency relief to be provided and the threat or impact to be addressed, an explanation of why the capital expenditure is appropriate, and a comparison of proposed capital expenditure against alternative capital expenditures. The IFR has all of the details on written justification requirements. As we mentioned, we have provided recipients the ability to use SLFRF for emergency relief for disasters that are the subject of Stafford Act disasters, if they also meet the definition of natural disaster that's outlined in the IFR. There are specific requirements that apply when recipients use federal funds to provide assistance with respect to losses suffered as a result of a major disaster or emergency declared under the Stafford Act. If you have ever administered other types of federal emergency relief under the Stafford Act, you will be familiar with duplication of benefits prohibition. If a recipient uses SLFRF funds to cover disaster losses subject to a Stafford Act declaration, the prohibition on duplication of benefits applies. Duplication of benefits requirements state that recipients may not provide financial assistance to a person, business, concern, or other entity with respect to disaster losses for which the beneficiary will receive financial assistance under any other program or from insurance or from any other source. Note that the uniform guidance, cost principles, requirements are applicable to all emergency relief from natural disasters uses, regardless of the type of declaration or designation. Again, please see the IFR for more details on the duplication of benefits requirements. Finally, just a reminder that recipients can use your state and local funds under this new eligible use for costs incurred on or after December 29th of 2022. Consistent with the existing eligible uses, you have until the end of 2024 to obligate funds and until December 31st, 2026 to expend the funds. So just as a reminder, when using SLFRF to provide emergency relief from natural disasters, please reference the two-step process that is outlined in the IFR by first identifying a natural disaster and then second, identifying emergency relief either through an enumerated eligible use or by identifying assistance needed to save lives and to protect property and public health and safety, or to lessen or avert the threat of catastrophe. As we've described in the IFR, recipients are not required to receive pre-approval from FEMA or Treasury, and Treasury does not pre-approve projects under this eligible use category. So next, I'm going to pass it off to Eric, who's going to take you through the statutory requirements for Title I and surface transportation projects.
Thank you, Carrie Ann. My name is Eric Roche, and I'm coming to you live from Pearland, Texas, which is inside of the Houston metro area. Today, I'm going to be talking about surface transportation, and then I'll be handing it off to Nick to talk about Title I projects. But first, we want to talk about some statutory requirements for both of these project types. What I'm about to cover is important to consider before you make plans for projects in either of these eligible uses. I will cover the items to consider now, and later in the presentation, we'll show you how these items relate to each of the two eligible uses. Now, let's take a look at 4 statutory requirements or key requirements created by Congress that apply to the surface transportation and Title I eligible uses. The requirements are the cap on use of funds, requirements of other laws, a supplement, not supplant provision, and the obligation and expenditure deadline. For these two eligible uses, it is important to note that there is a cap on the use of funds. Recipients may use up to the greater of $10 million and 30% of their total SLFRF award for surface transportation and Title I projects taken together. For example, say your government received an SLFRF allocation of $60 million. 30% of that $60 million allocation is $18 million. Your government has $18 million available for these two eligible use categories taken together. That means that you could direct $10 million towards surface transportation projects and $8 million towards Title I projects. You could direct $12 million towards Title I projects and $6 million towards surface transportation projects. Heck, you could put all $18 million towards surface transportation projects. But per the statute, your government with an SLFRF allocation of $60 million could not spend more than the $18 million in SLFRF funds on these two eligible use categories taken together. The next item to note here is that there are other applicable laws recipients must comply with when engaging in these eligible uses. These include Title 23, 40, and 49 of the U.S. Code, and Title I of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974. These apply to the use of funds for surface transportation and Title I projects as applicable, among other cross-reference statutory requirements. For more information, please see the 2023 Interim Final Rule, as well as the overview of the 2023 Interim Final Rule. Next, recipients using SLFRF funds for these uses must supplement, not supplant, other federal, state, territorial, tribal, and local government funds that are otherwise available for these projects. This supplement, not supplant requirement does not apply to the other eligible use categories, including the emergency relief from natural disasters eligible use category. Finally, and I really want to emphasize this here, so I'll talk about it a few times throughout the presentation, recipients must obligate funds by December 31st, 2024. This is the same obligation deadline that applies to the other eligible uses. And funds must be expended by September 30th, 2026. Importantly to note, this is 3 months earlier than the deadline to expend for all other eligible uses. Again, it's 3 months earlier than the other eligible uses, and surface transportation projects and Title I projects can be capital intensive and take time, so please plan accordingly. As we go through the next 2 eligible uses, we'll talk about what this looks like in each case. If you are considering surface transportation or Title I projects, review these 4 requirements from Congress first. As a reminder, these restrictions do not apply to housing in, As a reminder, these restrictions do not apply to housing and transportation projects funded under the revenue loss eligible use category. Now let's dig into the next eligible use, surface transportation. In this section, you will learn the following. We will cover the 3 pathways to using SLFRF funding for your surface transportation project. And next, we will briefly discuss how the requirements apply to these projects. We'll go through the rule and provide a couple of examples to illustrate what this could look like in your community. Just a reminder, the statutory requirements that we just went through apply to both Title I projects and surface transportation projects, but not the other eligible use cases. Recipients may use SLFRF funds to fund a wide array of surface transportation programs. In the surface transportation eligible use category, Treasury is going to discuss 3 pathways for using SLFRF funds. Recipients may use SLFRF funds for surface transportation projects under the following pathways. First, surface transportation projects that are currently receiving funding from the DOT or will be receiving funding from the DOT. Second pathway for surface transportation projects not receiving funding from the DOT. So these are probably going to be like your local road projects and things like that where the DOT is not involved. And pathway 3, satisfying non-federal share requirements for certain surface transportation projects or to repay a TIFIA loan. First, we will discuss pathway 1. This pathway will be of interest to recipients who want to supplement surface transportation projects that are or will be receiving funds from the Department of Transportation. You'll hear me refer to this as the DOT from now on. Recipients can use SLFRF funds for a surface transportation project that is receiving or will receive funding for projects eligible under one of the 26 DOT programs listed in the statute. I'll throw those 26 programs up on the screen here in a second. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about what you can do under this pathway. Recipients may expand the scope of existing DOT projects by adding additional SLFRF funds. They may also cover unexpected costs associated with the project receiving DOT funding. You may otherwise supplement funds for projects receiving DOT funding before December 31st, 2024. And just a reminder, a surface transportation project under Pathway 1 must be subject to DOT's oversight during the period that SLFRF funds are used for the project. And if you are using funds under Pathway 1, you must consult with the DOT before using SLFRF funds for a project. When using funds under Pathway 1, recipients must comply with all of the requirements of Titles 23, 40, and 49 that would normally apply to the project administered by DOT. And if you aren't familiar with these titles, it's okay. They generally cover things like highways and how the DOT is set up and reporting. And there's lots more in there in our overview as well as the final rule. Recipients must also comply with any reporting requirements that normally apply to the project as administered by the DOT. Recipients will also report additional information to Treasury. There are some limitations on the use of SLFRF funds for surface transportation programs. For example, funds may not be used to pay for operating expenses for some program types. Additionally, for projects eligible under Title 23 of the U.S. Code, or that otherwise would be subject to the requirements of Title 23, states must either demonstrate progress in achieving a state of good repair or support the achievement of a performance target. And again, that last bit there is just for state governments. Recipients can use SLFRF funds under Pathway 1 for surface transportation projects that are receiving funding within any of the 26 DOT programs listed here. The 2023 Interim Final Rule discusses each of these, and we encourage you to read the specific section relevant to any of the projects you wish to pursue. I'll spare you all reading all of these, but you can see they range from infra grants to the Rural Surface Transportation Grant Program, to fixed guideway capital investments, and to tribal transportation programs. There are a wide variety of programs here. Next, we will discuss Pathway 2. This pathway may be of interest for recipients looking to use SLFRF funds for surface transportation projects where the project is not receiving any funding from the DOT. There are two ways to use SLFRF funds within Pathway 2, the Streamline Framework and the non-Streamline Framework. For projects undertaken within the Streamline Framework, recipients are not required to obtain Treasury approval to use SLFRF funds for the project. A NEPA environmental review is also not required. We'll go a little bit more in depth on that in a minute. For projects undertaken outside the Streamline Framework, Treasury will design a process for recipients looking to undertake projects. Projects will be subject to Treasury approval, and recipients must satisfy NEPA environmental review requirements. First, we will go over what Treasury calls the Streamline Framework. Later, we'll briefly discuss a separate process for projects that fall outside of the Streamline Framework. As we will discuss more in a minute, the project approval requirements under Titles 23, 40, and 49 of the U.S. Code generally apply to recipients' use of SLFRF funds for surface transportation projects across all pathways. However, in the Streamline Framework, recipients are not required to obtain Treasury approval to use funds for eligible projects. One result of this bifurcated approach is that recipients using funds for surface transportation projects that are subject to approval requirements must satisfy NEPA environmental review requirements. Recipients using funds for surface transportation projects that are not subject to approval requirements are not required to conduct NEPA environmental reviews. The Streamline Framework provides a way for recipients to use their SLFRF awards to fund a variety of RAISE grant-eligible surface transportation programs that also meet additional criteria. For a list of eligible projects, please see DOT's 2023 RAISE Notice of Funding Opportunity. The link for the RAISE Notice of Funding Opportunity, also referred to as a NOFO, can be seen at the bottom of the screen. If you also search for 2023 RAISE grants, it'll pop right up and you'll be able to find it. That document will contain a list of the project types that are RAISE eligible. There are additional criteria. First, no more than $10 million of SLFRF funds may be used for a single project within the Streamline Framework. A government may fund multiple surface transportation projects up to the expenditure cap, so long as no single project receives more than $10 million. Second, any project within the Streamline version of Pathway 2 must be limited to activities that typically do not have a significant environmental impact. Recipients will need to ensure that the entire scope is limited to the set of actions or activities identified by the DOT as meeting the criteria for categorical exclusion. You can see on the screen here the relevant Code of Federal Regulations citations. As part of determining that a project meets this requirement, recipients must determine that those actions do not involve unusual circumstances, as described further in the 2023 Interim Final Rule. The same requirements generally apply here that we discussed in Pathway 1. For example, Titles 23, 40, and 49 apply. For some programs, SLFRF cannot be used for operating expense. I do want to make it clear, though, that we do not consider preventative maintenance to be an operating expense. And for states, A project eligible under Title 23 must either demonstrate progress in achieving a state of good repair or supporting the achievement of one or more performance targets. If a recipient wishes to pursue a project within Pathway 2, but outside of the guidelines of the Streamline approach with its $10 million cap and requirements that not be significant environmental impact, the recipient may submit a notice of intent to Treasury. Treasury will evaluate the projects included in these notice of intents, along with the comments on the IFR, to design and implement a framework for approving these types of projects. Projects outside of the Streamline Framework will be subject to Treasury approval. The notice of intent must be submitted to NOI-SLFRF@treasury.gov and is due 30 calendar days after the end of the IFR comment period. For an example of what an ideal notice of intent would include, please see the 2023 IFR section titled Pathway 2, Notice of Intent for Projects Outside the Streamline Framework. Next, we will discuss Pathway 3. Pathway 3 describes the narrow circumstances provided by the statute where recipients may use SLFRF funds to repay a TIFIA loan, or as if they were local funds to satisfy a non-federal share requirement for projects under the Infra Grant Program, the Fixed Guideway Capital Investment Grants Program, the Mega Grants Program, and for projects eligible for credit assistance under the TIFIA program. If recipients wish to pursue this pathway, they must consult with the DOT. So both Pathway 1 and Pathway 3 involve the DOT, and you need to consult with them. As with any use of funds to meet non-federal cost share requirements, the requirements associated with the project as administered by the DOT continue to apply unless provided otherwise by the DOT. You might be getting a little tired of this slide, but it's very important, and that's why we keep bringing it back. These restrictions and requirements apply to surface transportation projects and Title I projects. Again, SLFRF funds may be used for costs incurred beginning on December 29, 2022 for surface transportation and Title I projects. Funds must be expended by September 30th, 2026. Again, this is 3 months earlier than other eligible uses. For all three pathways, recipients must comply with the requirement that funds for surface transportation projects supplement and not supplant other federal, state, territorial, tribal, and local government funds as applicable that are otherwise available for such uses. This means that recipients may not deobligate funds and replace those previously obligated funds with SLFRF funds under the eligible use category, or use SLFRF to replace federal or non-federal funds identified in a federal commitment, such as an award agreement. So what does that actually mean? Well, here's an example. Consider a municipal road project that costs $30 million. The DOT is expecting to put in $25 million, and the local government is expected to put in $5 million to satisfy cost share requirements. In this case, the recipient has not yet entered into an award agreement with the DOT, and therefore they may choose to alter the funding mixture to include SLFRF funding. However, in the same scenario, if the recipient had already entered into an award agreement with the DOT, then the funds for the project may not be replaced with SLFRF funds. The recipient could not supplant federal or non-federal funds identified to DOT as part of the grant award, or terminate or renegotiate an existing contract for the construction of the project and use SLFRF funds to replace the previously identified or obligated funds for that purpose. In this scenario, recipients would still be able to use SLFRF funds to expand the scope of the project to cover unexpected costs after consulting with the DOT. As a reminder, there's a lot of great information out there and available about surface transportation projects in these various pathways. This was intended to be an intro, and we encourage you to look at the 2023 Interim Final Rule, as well as the overview of the Interim Final Rule. I also want to remind you that recipients may use SLFRF funding classified as revenue loss for the provision of government services, which may include activities that are eligible under the surface transportation eligible use category. To summarize the 3 pathways available, Pathway 1 is for projects receiving DOT funding. Pathway 2 is for projects not receiving DOT funding, and Pathway 3 allows recipients to use SLFRF funds to repay a TIFIA loan or to satisfy non-federal share requirements for certain projects. We also discussed the statutory and regulatory requirements that apply to these projects and that it varies based on path and project type. It's important to read the IFR as it pertains to your specific project to fully understand applicable requirements. Regarding the differences for surface transportation for other eligible uses, I want to remind you that expenditures for surface transportation projects are due 3 months earlier than the other expenses. They're due in September of 2026. Infrastructure projects take significant time, and no mechanism exists for Treasury to grant extensions beyond 2026. Please plan accordingly. Additionally, both surface transportation projects and Title I projects, which we'll discuss in a moment, have a spending cap, which we discussed towards the beginning of the presentation. Next, to discuss Title I projects, I would like to turn it over to SLFRF Policy Advisor, Nick Wu.
Thanks, Eric, and hi, everyone. I'm Nick Wu, and I'm a policy advisor in the Office of Recovery Programs, coming to you from Brooklyn, New York. Today, I'm going to provide a quick overview of what we will cover in this Title I project section, then go into depth on each of those sections, and then give a quick recap of what we discussed. For the Title I project's eligible use, we will discuss first, how to use funds for Title I projects, which are activities eligible in the Community Development Block Grant, CDBG, and the Indian Community Development Block Grant, or ICDBG programs that are available through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. Second, we're going to discuss program administration under this eligible use. And third, we'll discuss requirements from Congress that apply to this eligible use. So first, we'll start with an overview of the eligible projects under the Title I project's eligible use. Recipients may use funds under this eligible use for activities eligible under HUD's CDBG program and the ICDBG program for Indian and Alaska Native communities. Specifically, this means the activities as outlined in Section 105A of Title I of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974. For some background on CDBG, it's a program that's administered by HUD's Community Planning and Development Office, or CPD, which folks may be familiar with, and is a program that supports community development activities to build stronger and more resilient communities. Some folks on the call that also administer CDBG will be familiar with the many, many broad uses under the CDBG program. This slide outlines an illustrative list of activities that are eligible. They range from rehabilitation and reconstruction of housing to rental and homeowners assistance. Recipients should note that many of the uses in the Title I project's eligible use category are also eligible in the public health and negative economic impacts eligible use category, as discussed in the 2022 Final Rule, where there is no cap on the amount of SLFRF funds that may be directed toward ineligible use. Furthermore, the public health and negative economic impacts eligible use category also offers a standard for determining if other uses of funds beyond those specifically listed are eligible. Recipients seeking to use SLFRF funds for Title I projects may consider the relevant eligible uses and available funding levels to determine which eligible use category best supports their community's needs. Please note that this interim final rule does not alter the public health and negative economic impacts eligible use category, and you can find more information in the 2022 final rule. Next, we'll discuss the different requirements that apply to the Title I project's eligible use category. So, under this eligible use, the requirements of Title I of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974 and their associated regulations generally apply, except as provided otherwise in the IFR. We've identified a few of the applicable requirements on this slide, which you will also see on page 18 of the overview if you are following along on the phone. For all recipients, requirements related to the CDBG primary objective, the public services cap, the planning and administrative cost cap, the BEAD program related to broadband infrastructure, and NEPA environmental review requirements apply. And for non-tribal government recipients, requirements related to the CDBG national objectives and labor standards also apply. What I want to call your attention to today are the environmental review requirements, which will require pre-approval for projects in certain circumstances. As mentioned, NEPA environmental review requirements apply to all recipients undertaking projects under this eligible use. Accordingly, recipients must submit a project-level certification to Treasury and receive Treasury approval prior to using SLFRF funds for their projects under this eligible use. There are certain projects under this eligible use that do not require approval from Treasury. Recipients are not required to submit certifications or receive Treasury approval for Title I projects that are either 1, exempt activities as contemplated by the HUD regulations at 24 CFR 58.34a, or 2, that are categorically excluded activities not subject to HUD's regulations at 24 CFR 58.5, as contemplated by the regulations at 24 CFR 58.35b, provided that the circumstances described in 24 CFR 58.35c are not present. Recipients may begin using SLFRF funds right away for projects that meet either of those two criteria. Treasury will provide more detail on the content of the required environmental certifications and the related environmental review requirements, and will post that additional detail on the SLFRF website. Next, I want to provide a quick reminder of the statutory requirements that apply to this eligible use, as well as the surface transportation projects eligible use. As mentioned before, certain requirements from Congress apply to both this eligible use and the surface transportation projects eligible use. As a reminder, these include 1, the cap on funds limiting recipients to the greater of 10 million or 30% of their total SLFRF award for surface transportation projects and Title I projects taken together. 2, the applicability of the requirements of other laws, including the requirements of Title I for this eligible use. 3, that recipients must supplement and not supplant other federal, state, territorial, tribal, and local government funds as applicable that are otherwise available for these projects. And 4th, the earlier expenditure deadline for the surface transportation projects and Title I projects eligible uses. I want to focus on how the supplement not supplant requirement applies under this eligible use. As a reminder, recipients may not deobligate funds and replace those previously obligated funds with SLFRF funds under this eligible use category. And they also may not use SLFRF funds to replace federal or non-federal funds identified in a federal commitment, such as an award agreement. So to give you an example, consider an ongoing project for the construction of a community garden. If a recipient had already obligated non-SLFRF funds to the project, the recipient cannot terminate or renegotiate existing contracts for the construction of that garden in order to use SLFRF funds to replace the previously obligated funds. However, recipients could use program funds to do the following. They could provide additional resources to that project and expand the scope of that project, or they could undertake a separate but also eligible project. So for example, another community garden project in an adjacent neighborhood. Additionally, and as mentioned before, recipients must obligate their funds by December 31st, 2024, which is the same obligation deadline that applies to other eligible uses. However, they must expend funds by September 30th, 2026 under this eligible use, which is 3 months earlier than the deadline to expend for all other eligible uses, except for the surface transportation projects. As with the other eligible uses listed, please refer to the materials previously mentioned for more information about this eligible use. In sum, we have covered how to use funds for projects eligible under the CDBG and ICDBG programs. We've highlighted some of the requirements that apply to this eligible use and noted some key differences between this eligible use and the existing eligible uses. I will now hand it over to my colleague, Laura.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laura McDaniel, a policy outreach lead for the state and local fiscal recovery funds program, calling in from Washington, D.C. Now we'll talk about the public comment period and how you can provide comments on the interim final rule. I'm going to give you an address, so you may want to be ready to take notes if you are on the phone. So following the same process that Treasury used when we launched the program in 2021, we submitted an interim final rule to the Federal Register for publication. So this approach affords you as recipients the opportunity to submit comments on the interim final rule over a 60-day period. For those of you who can see the slides, the process for submitting your comments is displayed on the screen, and you can follow along as we review them. For those on the phone, you will want to find the instructions for how to submit comments in the interim final rule itself and on our website. So the IFR was submitted for publication on August 9th, 2023, and will become effective when published. That will also be the beginning of the public comment period. There are two methods of submitting your comments. The first is electronically through the federal e-rulemaking portal, and you can find that at http://www.regulations.gov. This method will be available once the IFR is published. If you would like to mail your comments, I'll give you the address for where to send your comments. You can send them to Office of Recovery Programs, Department of the Treasury, 1500 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C., 20220. So this is important. All of your comments should have the caption Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds 2023 Interim Final Rule comments. Along with that, you should include your name, your organization affiliation, your address, your email address, and your telephone number. So I want to note that in general, comments received will be posted on regulations.gov without change, including any business or personal information provided. Comments received, including attachments and other supporting materials, will be part of the public record and subject to public disclosure. Do not enclose any information in your comment or supporting materials that you consider confidential or inappropriate for public disclosure. So that concludes the presentation portion of our meeting for today. So as a reminder, the webinar was recorded, and both the webinar and the slides will be available on Treasury's website after the session. Thank you all for joining us today to learn about the new eligible uses for this program. We're going to turn shortly to the Q&A.